happens when we begin to realize that the 200-year experiment we've called the American healthcare system has failed. Tune in to Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD, and join the conversation about how to heal our broken system to reverse our current health crisis. The entire world is looking for answers, and the truth is hidden in plain sight. Learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, when you can call in and ask the questions that matter most to you.
And we're live.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mylaine Riobe, and you are listening to or watching Awakened Wellness. And we are live here on Dream Vision 7 Radio. So it's always a pleasure to be here with you. And today's topic is going to be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, or what was previously known as ADD. It's a very complex, I hesitate to call it a disorder, but that's what it's called, a disorder that affects mostly children. Some children will outgrow it before they reach adulthood, but it's increasingly plaguing our adult population now. And, you know, it's no surprise that when you compare our rates of ADHD to other developed countries, we have higher rates of ADHD here in the United States. It's generally accepted that the global rate of ADHD is about 5% worldwide. Here in the United States, it's about 8 to 12%. So it's a little bit higher. And of course, we're scrambling, trying to figure out, well, what is this condition and what causes this condition so that we can, of course, treat this condition. So ADHD is generally agreed to be a condition where focus is interrupted. People with ADHD tend to have what's called impulsivity. They have difficulty controlling impulses, so they'll kind of react abruptly, as opposed to being able to sit and think through a process before acting. They tend to be very reactive or impulsive. And certain people have the hyperactivity to go along with it. And that's where the term ADHD comes from. Some attention deficit does not involve hyperactivity. So sometimes these people they're not fidgety. They can sit still, but they're not focused. They're not actually paying attention. It's kind of like they're there, but they're not there. They might be daydreaming or otherwise inattentive, you know. And when we try and diagnose this condition, we start to run into the issue. It's really hard to diagnose. You know, we don't really have strict diagnostic criteria for it. When we try and find physiological evidence that would help us diagnose it, we can't find that. We've been trying to find the genes that cause it. We found some genes, but there's such a loose relationship between the genes, and the genes vary so widely that we can't point a finger and say this gene causes ADHD or this series of genes causes ADHD. So we generally agree in the allopathic medical community, it's generally agreed that it's some type of brain chemistry problem. We always point to the brain whenever we think of mental. And again, for those of you that watched or listened to our last live podcast on mental disorders, we talked a lot about how it's not really a brain problem. It's the brain is the organ that is affected, and we'll see changes there, but we will also see changes generally throughout the body. And those changes are generally induced by things outside of the brain, such as the environment. So environmental factors have a lot to do with mental disorders. They also have a lot to do with ADHD, although that has not yet been recognized by the mainstream medical system. So in the mainstream medical system, we're still trying to figure out what genes are causing ADHD. We're not going to find those genes because it's not going to be a genetic issue. It's going to be an environmental issue. And because we understand so little about genetics, we won't make that connection for quite some time. Even when we try and look at brain scans, so while in the allopathic or mainstream medical community, we agree, okay, it's some type of brain chemistry issue. And so let's do a brain study to try and figure out what areas of the brain are being affected in people with ADHD. We can't find that either because it's all over the map. So everybody with ADHD is going to have a different brain scan. There is nothing that is common to people with ADHD when you look at brain scans, whether you're looking at MRIs, whether you're looking at what's called SPECT scans. You will not find, oh, there's a disorder in this specific area of the brain, and that's what ADHD is. It seems to be kind of a global disorganization of the brain when we look at the brain for answers. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what's causing this global disorganization, right? And we want to find genes to say it's this gene and that gene and this gene. We're not going to find that. Now, we're going to find certain genes that will be altered in the case of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder because the environment does alter genes. We know that. So what we have to do is say, okay, if this is not purely genetic, let's look at the environment and see how the environment is impacting these genes. So there's a whole genetic registry now to collect all of the genetic information about ADHD. And the reason that we, in the mainstream model, we're so focused on genetic causes of ADHD is because we've done studies on twins, we've done studies on adopted children, and the conclusion is, well, even when twins are separated and they're in two different environments, they both have a tendency to have ADHD. And then we say, when children are adopted and they are put in a different environment, they will still share the same hereditary traits with their birth family, even if they're in a different environment. And so that leads us to believe that, oh, it must be genetic. But we have to remember where those genes were formed in the first place, right? They were formed in the mother's womb. And we have ample evidence now, scientific data, to suggest that the environment in that womb determines how your genes are structured. It determines whether your genes alter themselves or are expressed or not expressed. And so where they're cooked, in the womb dictates your fate once you're born. And we tend to mistake that as genetic, but it's not. That is environmental. It is the environment of the womb that causes these genetic changes that we then call genetic after the baby's born, but they are not in fact genetic, they are environmental. So we have ample evidence that if mothers are exposed to certain toxins, heavy metals, plastics, and other toxins, that will alter the genetics of the baby because that's what they do. Toxins alter genes. Also, poor diet also alters genes. So there was a really good study done by the University of Cambridge in March of 2011 that this was a study on rats, but rats and humans happen to share the same gene that was being studied. And so what they did was they gave the rats a bad diet while they were pregnant. And it was a diet that was low in protein. So it was a protein deficit type of diet. So they didn't give the mother rats enough protein in their diet. And then what they did was they studied the babies, the offspring of these rats. And what they found was the low protein diet altered a gene called HNF4A. That particular gene is responsible for a certain amount of the development of the pancreas. The pancreas is the organ that makes our digestive enzymes, and it also makes certain hormones, the most popular, the most well-known being insulin. And so what they found is the babies of the rats that were fed the bad diet that was too low in protein develop diabetes later in their life. Regardless of what else they did after those baby rats were born, they develop diabetes later in life. And so because humans also have those same genes, the conclusion is, if your mother has a bad diet, too little protein, and you don't activate that gene while you're in the womb, you will be born with a genetic predisposition to diabetes. And if you don't actively prevent diabetes through how you eat and how you manage your lifestyle, you will develop diabetes because you now have a predisposition. That's not genetic, that is environmental, because it's the environment where your genes were cooked that determined that. And so we have to really begin to distinguish what's really genetic from what's not really genetic. A truly genetic disorder is one where you inherit a mutated gene from your mother. So when the environment where you're cooked is not good and your genes are altered, that's not inheriting a bad gene from your mother. That's you had a normal gene that got damaged. That's different. A truly genetic disorder is your mother had a bad gene, and then now she gave that bad gene to you. For example, sickle cell. So there's a sickle cell mutation that if you get one copy from your mom and one copy from your dad, you're going to have sickle cell disease come hell or high water. Like, it doesn't matter what anyone does for you. It doesn't matter if they were to put you in a beautiful little perfect bubble like the Garden of Eden, where you were exposed to no toxins, where you had no stress. You're still going to have sickle cell disease no matter what interventions are done. That's truly genetic. That's different. That is not your mom gave you good genes, but the environment was toxic and therefore your genes got damaged. That's different. That's what causes ADHD. And that's a whole other conversation, because that's not genetic, right? That is environmental. And so there are certain things that we can do. There are interventions that we can then do if we know it's environmental to fix the environment. And then that will allow the genes to reorganize themselves, if you will. And we have ample evidence that that's possible. So those studies have been done. We have seen genes fix themselves. We have seen genes that we didn't want to be turned on get turned off, and other genes get turned on that we favored for good health. So those studies have actually been done. And there are over 100 different mechanisms in the human body to repair damaged genes. So, and that data is old, so we've studied that for 50 plus years now. And we know it's called the DDR, and it's basically a DNA repair mechanism that every human being has. So if one of your genes gets damaged, there is a system in your body to correct it. And so if it doesn't get corrected, it's because the environment stayed damaged. So if you don't resolve the environmental insults and you don't clean up the environment where the genes live, they'll just continue to be damaged, right? You're not going to be able to repair a gene in a damaged environment. And so we don't really do anything actively in our allopathic medical system to repair damaged genes. And so we keep thinking that things are genetic when they are not. So when we talk about ADHD, we have to consider that. We have to always keep that in mind, that is this really genetic? No, it's not really genetic. It's environmental. And it's the environment that damaged the genes that produced the so-called condition. And that's why when we do studies and we look, the results are all over the map. That's why we don't find specific things when we look for ADHD. Now we'll find common behaviors, right? So these kids or these adults have difficulty focusing. So they'll have shiny object syndrome and they're looking all around. And if you ask them to focus on something, they can't focus on it. Or they'll be very fidgety and they can't sit still, or they'll be very impulsive, so they'll react and they can't really sit through a situation to think it through before acting. And so when we see that cluster, we say, oh, this individual has ADHD. But if we look around, we can kind of see ADHD in everybody, right? Like there's nobody that doesn't have a focus issue anymore, right? We have seen studies to suggest that our attention span keeps dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. We used to be able to focus on something for an extended period of time as a species. And as time has gone by, we have become less and less capable of focusing on one thing for extended periods of time. And to the point where now they're claiming that the average human being has less of an attention span than a goldfish. A goldfish apparently has a 9-second attention span. We now have an 8.25-second attention span. And what is the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is distractions, right? We've never had this many distractions before. Even from when I was a kid, we didn't have, phones to distract us with notifications pinging onto our screen all day long. We didn't have computers that we had to work on. We just had a book to read or, a game to go play, so we were either playing baseball outside in the street or we were playing basketball in the backyard. We didn't have phones, we didn't have computers. Now those came along, so by the time I was a teenager, we had Atari and we were playing Pong, but we didn't have 50,000 games to choose from. We had one. We had computers, but the software was very limited. We didn't have 1,000 things vying for our attention all day. And if we really look at ADHD and say, well, what is it really? It's too many distractions. And the more distractions you have, the more focus you have to stay on that one path, right? And if you're distractible, you will get distracted, right? I mean, there are 1,000 notifications. We all look at our phones every day, right? The average human being spends 3.5 hours on their phone, and that's not even counting their computers on a daily basis. And the notifications keep coming unless you purposefully shut them off, right? It's as one's coming in now, right? And then things are popping up on your screen all day. And then there are the things going on in your house, right? So a simple act of walking your dog can send you on 10 different tangents, right? To go walk your dog, I have to walk through my kitchen, walk into the butler's pantry, walk into the laundry room, open the drawer, take out the leash and the bag, close the drawer, walk back out. And along the way, if I see dirty dishes in the sink, the thought might pop in, I should really wash those dishes before I walk the dog because so-and-so's coming over, or I have a meeting and, I don't want so-and-so to see dirty dishes in my sink, so let me wash the dishes first. And then as you're washing the dishes, you realize something else that takes away your attention. And then you see the dirty countertop, and then you see you spilled some water on the floor. And next thing you know, it's 2 hours and you haven't walked your dog, right? And then you may not even remember to walk your dog because now you've been on too many tangents to bring your mind back to the original thing. So if that original thing is not important enough to you, if something else keeps becoming a priority to you, your mind will wander, right? And so it's no surprise that we diagnose ADHD mostly in students, right? Because we can all go on and on about our education system, right? We just yanked our son out of a public school, put him back into private school. That experiment failed. Why? Because the system is not designed for education, and so it's no wonder that kids don't pay attention in school, right? It's not a big shock. When my daughter was 2 or 3, we put her in a school, and this was actually a private school, but nonetheless, we put her in school. She was so bored with what she was learning because she was so much more advanced than what the class was learning that she was just doing this in the classroom all day. And of course, we got the call, your daughter has ADHD and blah, blah, blah. I was like, my daughter does not have ADHD, and it was a psychologist who's a colleague of mine who called me and said, they have no idea what to do with your daughter. She's too far advanced for the class. And it's not that she's not paying attention, it's that she's actually reading the walls. So, in school, they have all these little paintings and sayings on the wall. She was just reading them. and they didn't think she was old enough to know how to read. And so they were mistaking that for her not paying attention. And so it was my colleague who diagnosed that my daughter was actually simply reading, and she was bored with the material because she already knew it. And they didn't believe my colleague. They were like, no, she's too young. She doesn't know how to read. And they literally took her over to the library and gave her a book, and she read it from cover to cover for them. Now, we knew she knew how to read before we sent her to school, so we just didn't tell them that she knew how to read. We assumed they'd figure it out, which they did not. But these are the types of things that our children are running into, and they're being labeled as ADHD. So if I were not a doctor, and I also were not a holistic doctor, I might have gone along with that diagnosis, but thankfully I had a colleague who was present there and figured out what I already knew, which was that she was just reading. She knows how to read. And so, you have to really know. And if you don't have a medical background, you don't have a holistic background, you may just buy into this diagnosis because it's in every kid that does one of these, they're labeled as ADHD. And no, maybe it's your curriculum. Maybe it's that you're not challenging our kids enough. Maybe it's that the stuff is irrelevant and the curriculum needs to be updated, right? And so we have to really question, who are we calling ADHD? Do they really have ADHD, or is it just a failure on our part to adequately stimulate these kids? So it's ironic that some of the treatments are stimulants, right? Drug stimulants that we put these kids on to help them focus. Well, what if we just stimulated their environment instead by challenging them properly, by giving them things that they were interested in learning, and allowing them to learn and advance and grow at their rate instead of at the way that we tend to teach, which is, subpar, frankly. So the treatment for ADHD is not drugs. It's really for us to better understand our own children and to better stimulate them academically and give them more things that they love to do so that they are engaged in doing what they love. So a lot of ADHD is simply, I'm bored, I don't like what I'm learning, and I'm just gonna go off somewhere else where I want to be. Now, if that continues for too long, your brain then starts to hardwire those behaviors in, and that's where the impulsivity comes in and the hyperactivity comes in, is when you can't control those because now your brain is storing this other data that you're finding painfully boring and you're wanting to move away from, but your brain is still storing that information. And so when we really want to look at ADHD and how to treat ADHD, we have to look at all those things. We don't forget any experiences. So as we're sitting there bored to tears, not knowing what to do because we don't want to learn what's being taught, we're forming brain patterns from the experience. And that can, if it's a stressful experience, especially when that child is labeled with a condition and, God forbid, treated for that condition, and doesn't actually need the treatment, it becomes a stress to that child. And stimulants are very stressful because it's like running on adrenaline. It's like drinking way too much caffeine. It focuses you in the short term, but it wears you out in the long term. And that's what we see in a lot of ADD clients, is their adrenal system, the system that is responsible for handling stress on a physiological level, gets burnt out due to the stimulants. And so we have to really reframe ADHD. We have to really have a more comprehensive way of assessing it, treating it, and then stimulate the mind in a different way, not with drugs, but with information that that particular individual can learn, and that can keep up with the pace at which they're learning it. I believe our children are sponges. I believe all children are vastly intelligent. I just think they're under challenged in school. I don't think they are allowed to reach their maximum potential. And I understand all the different reasons. There are thousands of children in school and they have to teach to the average child. I get that. But we really have to look at if that's the right way to educate our kids, right? So if we really want to treat ADD, we have to look at the education system that is producing this ADHD. And then the home environment, right? We know that the average American is exposed to up to 200 different toxins every morning. And so that is going to play into ADHD, as we'll talk about on the other side of this commercial break. So you're listening to Awakened Wellness. I'm your host, Dr. Mylaine Riobe. Give us a call. Our number is 646-558-8656, and just hit *9 to raise your hand. When we come back, we'll answer some questions and look at some comments. Thank you for listening.
What happens when we begin to realize that the 200-year experiment we've called the American healthcare system has failed? Learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness on Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD. Tune in every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, when you can call in and ask Dr. Mylaine the questions that matter most to you. Dr. Mylaine is the medical director of the Riobe Institute of Integrative Medicine in Jupiter, Florida. For more information, visit RIOBE-integrativemedicine.com. Dream Vision 7 Radio Network invites you in for this dynamic, forward-thinking show.
Join Dr. Bernie Siegel on Mind Health Matters every Thursday and Friday, 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. Bernie will draw from his inspirational personal journey, offering us special nuggets of his sacred wisdom weaved through his delightful stories. Listen in as Bernie reminds us to be fully engaged in life.
Ever wonder what it's like to have your own radio show? Well, wonder no longer, because you can dip into the radio airwaves by being host for the day on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. It's a fabulous way to get your radio feet wet. It's an opportunity to market your business, modality, or book. Have a guest, mention a sponsor, and take callers. Or you may want to facilitate a lesson by going solo. It's up to you. Listeners can be online, mobile, in cars with Bluetooth, or listen through Amazon's Echo by asking, Alexa, play Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. For more details, go to dreamvision7radio.com and click on Host for the Day.
Looking for a fun and relaxing getaway? Omega Rest and Rejuvenation retreats are a great way to unwind and renew your spirit. Sit and read in the garden, explore the woodland trails, or try a daily yoga or meditation class. You can stretch your body, quiet your mind, and do as much or as little as you choose. Located in Rhinebeck, New York, just 90 miles north of New York City, Omega's natural environment and quiet pace allow for extraordinary experiences to unfold. Learn more at eomega.org.
Delight your kids with an enchanting journey by reading the Paper Doll Kids children's book by Deborah Beauvais and Janine Sullivan. There's even a catchy tune, Kids for Love Song, produced by Bob Sherwood and sung by kids just like yours. The story weaves around 7 paper dolls flying around the world doing good deeds as they bring important attention to our endangered animal friends. There's even a magical ring with a universal message. Kids become interested in service projects, action through compassion, and planting seeds that nurture positive change. The Paper Doll Kids and Kids for Love Song are a production of the Kids for Love Project. Get the book now on Amazon Kindle and the song on CD Baby or iTunes.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
And we're back.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome back to Awakened Wellness. I'm your host, Dr. Mylaine Riobe. I am the medical director of the Riobe Institute of Integrative Medicine down here in Jupiter, Florida. And I have been in practice for about 20 years now, a little over 20. I am double board certified in obstetrics and gynecology, as well as the exciting new field of integrative medicine, which is a new holistic branch of medicine accepted as a medical specialty back in 2014. And so it kind of gives me a unique viewpoint on different conditions and disease prevention as someone who has my feet in both worlds, if you will. And so I think we had some questions come in. Take a look at them. We did. Okay. Is this the same illness that we used to give our kids medication for? I'm not sure what medication you're trying to indicate here. It's not familiar to me, but I'm thinking maybe you're referring to Ritalin. My son had to take these pills at school, at home, and on the weekends. He developed seizures at 17 and at 20. Oh, and he passed away. I'm so sorry to hear that. There are, like other conditions that develop with children who are labeled as ADHD. So insomnia, mental disorders, anxiety, depression are often linked, and even autism is linked with, the diagnosis. I hesitate to use the word diagnosis, but of ADHD. And so I'm terribly sorry to hear that, but it sounds perhaps, and I don't know, of course, this is just a guess, perhaps there was something else going on that manifested as ADHD that led to his severe illness and death in his 20s. So my condolences for your loss. But typically ADHD will not cause death. And the medications, although they're not terribly good for people, are typically not, that's not the trajectory that people typically take when they take these medications. There aren't large numbers of deaths and things like that we see with ADD treatment. That's not the typical trajectory of ADHD. So perhaps there was something else going on there. So I'm sorry, I don't quite know how else to answer the question, but yes, Ritalin was used and now Adderall is being used. So they're basically stimulants. And so what we find is if we raise the stimulant levels in the body, people are able to focus. So what you're doing is you're mimicking a fight or flight response, right? When we're under threat, we hyper focus, like we're laser beams, looking at the threat and making sure we're not in danger. And so when you take something like an Adderall, you're kind of mimicking that all the time. And that's why it's easier to focus, because your body's in this fight or flight response more acutely. And so, of course, for people who have listened to my podcast long enough, we all know the long-term consequences of that, right? When you're forcing the body to be stimulated chemically for years, nothing good can possibly come of that. But then the question is, well, what else can we do? The only way that my son or daughter can pass her classes is by taking this drug so she can focus on her studies or he can focus on his studies. What else do you expect me to do, right? And the answer is we need to look a little bit more widely at the answer. So the answer is going to be environmental. The answer is going to be, what can I do to clean up the cellular environment in my child's brain and entire body that will lend itself to focusing properly and being able to pay attention and to retain memory, right? So when we learn something, we develop a memory of that thing. But if we don't reinforce it by focusing on it over and over and over, we don't develop solid memory. And if we don't solidify that memory pattern, it just falls apart. So if we're not able to keep refocusing on learning a particular thing, we will not absorb that thing. We will not learn that thing. Just like math, you can't do one math problem and understand a concept. You have to do numerous math problems where you're practicing the same thing over and over and over. What's happening is your brain is developing, connections that it can then recall that information, rapidly. So the next time you see that math problem, your brain will say, oh, where have I seen that before? And it will go back to its storage closet and say, oh yeah, that's this operation and that mathematical operation. And that's how we get the answer. And then you can do the math problem. So if you have ADHD, you're not going to be able to solidify that memory because you're not going to be able to focus. Part of the reason for that is because the brain is disordered. And we see that on MRI studies and SPECT scans. We see that the brain is simply disordered. And what that reminds me of is heart math, right? Anxiety, depression, stress disorders the brain. It causes the left and right sides of the brain not to properly communicate, causes different areas of the brain not to fire properly. And so breathing, right? Back to heart math. Heart math has been shown to cause or to lead to coherence of the brain. So the brain is able to better communicate and go back into the closet and bring forth the information better. It's also able to store things in the closet and form the memories from focus better. And also heart math has been shown through studies to help mitigate the impact of stress, which is a big factor in ADHD. And so the breath, something as simple as proper breathing and teaching children how to breathe properly or how to meditate. And they've done these studies, so we understand that our brain reorganizes itself when we meditate. Harvard University did studies on this. There were significant structural brain changes in meditators. And so these studies are out there. We can find them. And so we can reorganize the brain rather than have someone take medication. I don't treat a lot of children in my practice, but I have had parents come to me and ask me to treat their children because they did not want their children on medication, and yet they admittedly could not focus and they were hyperactive or impulsive or all three. And when we evaluate these kids, according to traditional Chinese medicine, we start to see patterns of energy or physiology, if you will, that are the causes of the ADHD. So we start to see the links between the energy causing the brain disorganization. And if we can balance those patterns, we can then clean up the brain environment and allow those kids to think more clearly. Typically what we find, again, these are just a few case studies. I'm not a pediatrician. I don't treat a lot of children. But the one universal thing we have found is that almost all of these children have gut issues. And here I go again with the gut issues. But they have absorption problems. So I can't remember exactly which institution did this study, if it was Johns Hopkins or a Cleveland Clinic. I'd have to go back and look for the reference, but they were looking at pediatric children. And they said that up to about 70% of children who are referred to a gastroenterologist will have a gut infection in the small intestine that will likely remain undiagnosed, because most pediatricians and most gastroenterologists, even pediatric gastroenterologists, don't recognize this condition yet and don't know how to treat it. And so we find this condition in children who have ADHD or focus issues. And if we can successfully treat it and put those kids on the proper supplements, they focus better, they have more energy, and they can store memory better. They're not as impulsive, they can sit still longer. So we have been able to help parents avoid medicating their children simply by correcting the physiological findings that lead to the brain not functioning properly, right? So there is a link between the gastrointestinal system and the brain. there's a link also between the heart and the brain. And so we understand that if there's a gastrointestinal issue, there will likely be a brain issue. And so fixing the gastrointestinal system, it should be no surprise that if we fix the gastrointestinal system, or at least allow it to function better, that should have positive brain effects. So shouldn't be a big shock that, oh, we can fix ADHD this way. Yes, we can. And so the problem with the gut issue in this particular infection is these kids cannot absorb their food properly. Even if they're taking vitamins, they may not absorb them properly because of the inflammation that is in the gastrointestinal system. So these kids become nutritionally depleted. And when you have a nutritional depletion, you will not be able to focus. You're going to be wired and tired. That's the typical kind of thing that we see with children is when kids are tired, they don't say, "Mommy, I'm tired, I'm going to go take a nap." They go bonkers, right? They start bouncing off the walls, and that's your cue that they're actually tired, right? So they have the exact opposite response. They become impulsive. They start, bouncing off the walls. They won't sit still. And that's because they're actually tired, right? And so you have to kind of wind them down and get them to go to sleep. And then when they wake up, they feel much better. So kids tend to become hyperactive when they're tired. So we call that, tired and wired. And so if we can fix the nutritional deficits that cause them the fatigue, then the toxic environment that developed because of that inflammation, because of those nutritional deficits, will eventually resolve. And now their energy will come up. And people think, well, they'll become more hyper. No, they will actually become more focused, not more hyper. They will become less hyper. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but that's actually what happens. So we had another question. That was a wonderful question. Again, I'm so sorry about your son. Another question: I'm a senior citizen now. I can easily get overwhelmed by having too much to do. So I'm finding I'm lost before I even get half my to-do list done. Yeah, I'm not a senior citizen and I have that problem. So that's modern living, right? We have kind of allowed this tsunami of to-dos to end up on our lists every day. And what I have found is, paradoxically, again, just like when we improve the energy of kids, they get calmer. When we decide we're going to do less, we actually do more. And so I've noticed this for myself, right? I started taking things off my plate. I just started saying, I'm not going to work 5 days a week anymore. It's too much. So I started working 3 days a week instead. And of course, the idea was, I'm going to make less money. I'm not going to be able to see as many patients. My productivity is going to go down. It actually went up. And so there's this thing about getting more out of doing less. And each individual person has to figure out what that means for them. For me, it was not working 5 days a week anymore. Because it was too much, and when we do integrative medicine, we spend so much time with our patients and then so much time after they've actually left. So if I'm on a call with a patient for 30 minutes or an hour, my work begins when I get off the phone. Now I'm like researching and looking at their chart and, making sure that I write a note that they can understand later, prescribing the right supplements, making the right changes. So it takes a good 2 hours per patient. So working 5 days a week was exhausting me, and I was actually less productive and I couldn't think as clearly. And when I decided, okay, I'm going to scale back, see fewer patients, I actually became much more productive. I actually made more money, and, it's counterproductive, but less is best at any time. And things that you need more of, more sleep, more rest during the day, right? More things that aren't distracting. So the to-do list probably needs to be wean down, right? And I forget where I read this, but there's the 3 Ds, right? You either do it, you delegate it, or you delete it. You know? And so that's been my mantra. And I thought if I stopped doing certain things, my life would cave in. And it kind of did one of these, and then it did this, because my life had to reorganize itself, right? And so it feels chaotic when it's being reorganized, but then when you get out the other side of it, you realize that now, okay, my life's actually better than it was, even though I thought it was going to get worse. And so looking at your to-do list, right? We do this a lot with our clients. It's like, what is really actually necessary for you to do on a daily basis? And if something is absolutely necessary, can somebody else do it, or can you hire somebody else to do it? If it's not absolutely necessary, can you just get rid of it, you know, and not do it? And my clients find that over time, they start weeding out things. And they thought it was just going to be the end of the world if they didn't do that thing. But then suddenly they realized that their world got shifted and they didn't have to do that thing, you know, because now their life goes on without that thing and it's fine, you know. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, we put too much on our plates. That's the bottom line. There's only 24 hours in the day, 8 to 9 of which have to be spent sleeping, another hour or so eating, another hour or so exercising. So that leaves, you know, not that much time to do a bunch of junk that is A, undesirable, B, unnecessary. So I would weed the to-do list down as much as possible and do things that you really love to do. You know, of course, there are things that are necessary. You have to pay your bills and do all those things. But as much as you can put those on autopilot, you know, and then just kind of watch over what's happening, you know, the better. So I hope that helps you. It's a great question. Time for our next commercial break. So we have a couple more questions that we'll address on the flip side of this commercial. You're listening to Awakened Wellness. I'm your host, Dr. Mylaine Riobe, and we'll be right back. Rachel, world, you know, and we look at our society, I think if we really want to make a dent in mental disorders or ADHD, or you know, anxiety, all the things that are plaguing us increasingly more and more, highlighted by the COVID pandemic, but not caused by the COVID pandemic, we have to look in the mirror, right? We have to really take a hard look at what are we exposing ourselves to? And could these things that we're exposing ourselves to be causing these types of conditions? You know, be causing what we label as ADHD or mental disorders or any other disease, right? There's always this debate that diseases are genetic and they're not environmental, they're not really lifestyle related, but they are. You know, we have ample evidence. Harvard University has published data on this now. You know, vast majority of the diseases that we get are preventable diseases. We know this. And so for us to continue to argue that, no, it's genetic, you know, obviously we have our head buried in the sand and it's time to yank it out. So we have to start to really take a good, long, hard look at why do 8 to 12% of our children, that's average of 1 out of every 10, have attention deficit hyperactivity, you know, disorder, if that's what we want to call it. You know, we have to ask ourselves, what are they being exposed to at home? Are they stressed out at home? Are they stressed out at school? What are they eating? What's in the house that they're being exposed to? And how can we clean that up? And what else can we do? You know, and again, we understand that organizing the brain can be done, right? It's through meditation, through heart math. But of course, it's really hard to get someone who's fidgety to sit still and meditate, right? And to learn how to meditate. And that's why I love heart math, because it's 3 minutes. If you can get them to sit still for 3 minutes, they can do heart math. And if you can simply get them to engage in the steps of heart math, they will be engaged. You know, even video games, there are certain video games now that are being suggested as being able to focus kids' brains. I haven't seen any hardcore, you know, medical science behind that, but I can see the mechanism, right? Because you're focusing on solving a problem on the screen. And so that allows you to focus. But part of it is the kids like video games, right? It's also that they like the activity. And one of the things that I love about certain education programs is they understand that children have varying degrees of interest in different topics. And so certain schools allow kids to kind of meander around and learn kind of what they want. So they have to come up with their plan. So there's a list of things they must do, right, in order to satisfy, you know, their curriculum. But they get to choose the order that they want to do them in, so that if they don't feel like doing this particular subject this morning, they can do it this afternoon and do this other subject this morning. That way the kids can do what they wanted to do, and they have a sense of agency. They have a sense of control over their education, as opposed to just being, you know, things being thrown at them throughout the day. So we have to take a good hard look at how are we educating our kids? Is it really in their favor, the way they're being educated? And we understand that our education system was designed to produce factory workers and the military. And we have not altered our education system. And we're still training our children to work in factories and join the military, and have not kept up with the fact that we are now in the information age and technology. And so we have to really begin to ask ourselves, what can we do differently? And so as a parent, what can I do differently for my own children? You can get them to do heart math. You know, that's one thing. And there's good data around heart rate variability and heart math, to get kids to focus better, to calm them down, to help them sleep better, to help them to cope with stress better. We can take away the sugar, right? We can, we can reduce the amount of sugar. Sugar is a stimulant, right? So we can replace those things with vegetables and proteins and fats. Now that doesn't mean, you know, kids can't have any sugar. You know, they can have some fruits and different things, but we have to really start to shift their diets around so that their primary diet's healthy. So if they have something not so healthy here and there, it's not going to send them off, off the deep end. We also have to look at sleep. A lot of our kids don't get enough sleep. You know, they're up late, they've got artificial light keeping them up, or they don't sleep well. Getting kids to sleep better is critical. You know, kids need like 9 hours of sleep. So they have to be in bed and asleep for 9 hours, really, for them to restore themselves, because they're growing, right? So when kids are growing and growing and growing, they need more and more and more rest, right? And we are in an environment that gives them less and less and less rest. And so we have to look at these basic things. And then if there's a significant issue, right, that child can't learn, that, they're not doing well on their exams, then it may be necessary to have them see an integrative medical doctor, or even a doctor of Oriental medicine. Chinese herbs and acupuncture, do very well for ADHD as well. And integrative medicine, again, looking at the gastrointestinal system, looking to see if there's an infection. There's an infection, looking for vitamin deficiencies, correcting those vitamin deficiencies, and fixing the infection. And then as the vitamin levels come up, that child will have more energy. And again, more energy doesn't mean they'll be more hyper. It means they'll actually be calmer, because their brain will be more organized. The hyperactivity comes from the brain darting around and not being able to really stay on a path. So once the brain has enough energy to function, it actually calms down. And I know that seems contradictory, but that's it. So anybody who's got kids knows this. When they're tired, they literally get more hyper, and so, they start to cry, or they have temper tantrums, or, whatever the case may be. And as a mom, we kind of start to figure out, oh, that means they're tired, and we tend to that. And then we see them wake up better, right? Are we out of time?
We're only got about 3 minutes left, but we did have a question about dieting. This Cove asked a question about, he's gone to a high protein diet and his clarity as thoughts are less foggy? Is there a connection with diet?
Absolutely.
3 minutes left. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, please do. I'm very happy that you did. That's a great question. Absolutely, right? And so I love protein. That's my favorite food. And I know there's a lot of controversy around protein, but your entire body is made of protein. Your entire brain is made of protein. And if you're not eating enough protein, your body deteriorates. And that's why we see as people get older, they have brittle bones, they lose muscle mass, they lose mental function. It's because they're not keeping up in many ways with their nutritional demands. You know, we tend to eat less and less protein. And so, but again, I always frame that with, you got to eat the right types of protein. So you don't want to just eat any protein. You want to make sure that it's healthy protein. And it's not been fed hormones and given grains that have pesticides on them. So you want to make sure that, you know, your meat sources or fish sources or egg sources are as natural as possible and organic, if at all possible. But yes, high protein diet is extremely important. It also manages blood sugar levels, which is key to reducing inflammation. So no surprise at all that an increased protein diet sharpens focus. Absolutely. So a lot of times what I do is I have my clients increase protein, drop sugar, and that helps them feel much, much better. Plus it helps maintain your metabolism better as well with a high protein diet. So that's a phenomenal question. Thank you for asking it. And I think we're out of time, right, Rachel?
Yeah, we're out of time. It was a great show though, but we got to go.
Thank you for your questions and many, many blessings. I'm Dr. Mylaine Riobe. You've been listening to Awakened Wellness here on Dream Vision 7 Radio, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Join us next time on Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD, to learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness. Awakened Wellness airs every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern of each month. Meanwhile, you can join our Facebook page at facebook.com/awakenedwellness and let us know what you'd like to discuss on future episodes. Dr. Mylaine is the medical director of the Riobe Institute of Integrative Medicine in Jupiter, Florida. For more information, visit riobeintegrativemedicine.com. This show is part of the Dream Vision 7 Radio Network.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax,